Good afternoon. I'm Arshad Mohammed. I'm a reporter with Reuters. I'm pleased to moderate this discussion on preventing further proliferation in the Middle East. We have an excellent panel. Immediately to my left is Kelsey Davenport, who's the Director of Non-Proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. Next to her is Sharon Squassoni, who's a Professor of International Affairs at George Washington University's Elliot School. And next to her is Negar Mortazavi, who is a Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy and is also the host of the Iran podcast. I, Kelsey, and Sharon will make some very brief introductory remarks, and then we'll start in on a discussion among the four of us and wrap up with questions from all of you submitted in writing. To start, let me make 4 points that I fear are really very well known to the people in this room. First, nuclear proliferation has been an issue in the Middle East for decades. With one presumed nuclear power, Israel, Iran currently at threshold status in the sense of having the capability to produce fissile material in fairly short order, and Saudi Arabia clearly seeking to keep its nuclear weapons options open. Since the Trump administration in 2018 pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed US sanctions, Iran, after waiting for about a year, began curtailing its compliance with that agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and has steadily increased its capability to produce bomb-grade nuclear material. And although it has not actually done so, and it has steadily reduced the International Atomic Energy Agency's access to its facilities. Third, again, obvious but worth bearing in mind, regional tensions have increased since Hamas's October 7th attack on southern Israel, Israel's subsequent retaliatory military operation in Gaza, and it's worth also noting Israel's April 1st unacknowledged, but I think undisputed, attack on the Iranian embassy complex in Damascus and Iran's unprecedented, till then, decision to attack Israel from Iranian soil. That was a first. And then finally, as I bet you all are very well aware, the United States and Saudi Arabia are discussing what might be termed a mega deal, one in which there would be potentially a US-Saudi civil nuclear deal. There would be some form of US security guarantee to the kingdom. There would be some kind of formulation on a pathway to a Palestinian state. And there would be, in theory, normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The Biden administration is exploring that civil nuclear agreement, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia is, of course, a massive oil producer and has no obvious immediate need for nuclear power. And also despite Saudi Crown Prince's Mohammed bin Salman's position that if Iran developed a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia would have to too. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Kelsey first to offer her thoughts on some of these issues.
Well, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Arshad, for agreeing to moderate. If you weren't moderating, I probably would be, so I have the much easier job of just sitting here and telling you all what I think. Also, I just want to thank Negar especially for joining us on very short notice to fill in for this panel, so we're very grateful that she was able to do that, and much appreciated.
My pleasure.
So those of you who know my work at the Arms Control Association will not be surprised that I'm going to focus my remarks on Iran's nuclear program and the possible implications for diplomatic engagement with Iran. But first, just to look at Iran's nuclear advances over the past several years, we really need to recognize now that Iran's nuclear program is in a fundamentally different place than it was in the lead up to negotiations on the JCPOA. Because the advances that Iran has made since the nuclear deal was finalized in 2015 have really brought Iran to the threshold of nuclear weapons. And much of the work cannot be fully reversed, even if we are able to re-engage Iran diplomatically and reach an agreement that limits its nuclear program. In particular, I would highlight two areas where Iran has clearly invested a lot of time and energy in recent years. It's mastered enrichment up to 60%, which is a level that technically can be used for nuclear weapons. It isn't considered weapons grade, but it's very close. Similarly, Iran has invested a lot of money in its advanced centrifuge capabilities. This allows Iran to enrich uranium much more quickly than it could in the past. And it means that if Iran ever needed to reconstitute its nuclear program, it could build its capacities up much more quickly by focusing on developing and operating just these more efficient centrifuge machines that were stringently limited under the JCPOA, but now that Iran is employing and operating in mass. So this really has changed fundamentally the nature of Iran's nuclear program. And I would say right now there are three significant implications that these developments have on proliferation risk. First, as Arshad noted, Iran is now much closer to weapons-grade uranium than it ever has been in its history. This is a time frame that we frequently refer to as breakout, how quickly a country can amass enough weapons-grade material for a bomb. And that breakout time frame for the first weapon is about 1 week. And the breakout timeline for 5 or 6 nuclear weapons is about a month. So that's really quite crucial because we're getting into these time frames where there's a real risk that Iran could try to produce weapons-grade material for a bomb between IAEA inspections, or divert some of its 60% enriched material to a covert program and more quickly complete the process up to 90% in that parallel program. So this drop in breakout is certainly concerning. The other aspect of proliferation risk I would highlight is that because of these advances that Iran has made, it can now reconstitute its nuclear program much more quickly. So while I personally do not believe there is a viable military option to addressing the Iranian nuclear risk, as we heard Pranay say earlier, force does remain on the table for the United States. But even if we did resort to force, Iran could reconstitute its capabilities much more quickly by relying again on these advanced machines. So it would not need to build up the same size of infrastructure to pose, again, a risk from a proliferation perspective. So that, again, is another significant difference that changes proliferation risk. The third thing I would highlight is that Iran's advances have really opened up new pathways to nuclear weapons if the decision were ever made to do so. I would say the sneak out risk, trying to use undeclared facilities is more viable now given the advancements and the shortened time frame. How Iran would proceed in enriching to weapons grade levels, it has different options now with the different enriched stockpiles and centrifuges. And so all of this, again, changes our overarching understanding of Iran's nuclear program and the risk it poses. And unfortunately, these advances cannot be fully reversed. A deal that limits Iran's capabilities, that rolls back stockpiles or centrifuges, could mitigate the risk posed by some of these developments. But again, we're looking at a future where even if we have a nuclear agreement with Iran, Tehran is likely to be closer to a bomb than in the past from a technical perspective. And then unfortunately, layered on top of these technical advances is the increased risk posed by the lack of intrusive International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring and access, which Arshad also mentioned that Iran has limited over the past several years. Currently Iran still is implementing its Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, so inspectors are regularly in facilities where Iran is enriching uranium. But as we know from past experiences with the case of Iraq, with the case of North Korea, this comprehensive safeguard agreement isn't sufficient to defend against determined proliferators. And right now, the IAEA does not have access to key facilities like the workshops where Iran is making its centrifuges, where it's concentrating and producing uranium ore concentrate. And so the IAEA does not have a good idea about what inventories in these areas look like. And IAEA Director General Grossi even said explicitly in the fall that the IAEA cannot say where all of Iran's centrifuges are, or even if it knows how many centrifuges that Iran has. So again, this just increases the risk or the speculation of risk that Iran may be diverting materials to some type of illicit program, diverting centrifuges that it could use later if it makes the decision to pursue nuclear weapons or to kind of retain that covert capacity. The other risk that is amplified by this lack of monitoring is that the longer these gaps persist, the more challenging it's going to be for the agency to try to reconstitute a history of Iran's nuclear program, which could be very beneficial and necessary if we do get to the point where we negotiate a new nuclear deal with Iran. If the IAEA, for instance, cannot say with reliability how many centrifuges Iran has, it's very challenging to verify future limits that might be imposed in these areas in a future deal. And that has implications for the sustainability of a deal, for effectively verifying limits, but also in the U.S. domestic context. Under U.S. domestic law, the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, the president has to certify that the IAEA can verify any future agreement with Iran. So these monitoring gaps pose a risk in the long term and in the short term when we talk about being able to ensure that we could quickly detect breakout, that we can deter Iran from diverting materials, and in the long term in trying to kind of understand these gaps and rebuild and reconstitute a history of Iran's nuclear program. So that kind of brings me to the second point of my remarks, what can we do about it? And I am still an optimist that there is time, space, and interest in Tehran in negotiations and in nuclear risk reduction. To be clear, I think we need to acknowledge and say up front that the 2015 nuclear deal is dead. Now, as a big supporter of the deal, it pains me to say that, but I think that is the reality. Iran's program technically has advanced to the point where the JCPOA would be less effective from a nonproliferation standpoint. Politically, the deal is very toxic in both Washington and Tehran. And if we look at just timeframes going forward, reconstituting it just really isn't an option, both given the political realities that we face with the US election, but also some of the timeframes and expiration dates in the JCPOA itself. So if we move past the JCPOA, what does that leave us with? Given the short time frame between now and the US presidential election, I think the US strategy really should be focused on reciprocal actions that more immediately de-escalate risk. I would focus squarely on trying to enhance monitoring and access. The US should, I think, be looking at ways to try to incentivize Iran to allow inspectors back into some of these facilities, like the centrifuge workshops, like the facilities where the uranium ore concentrate is produced, so the agency can get a better feel for what Iran has produced here and start to rebuild those gaps. This would also be incredibly useful in deterring any diversion going forward to prevent Iran, like I said, from trying to move any materials to a covert program. So monitoring, I think, really should be the #1 priority. And in return, the US should put something tangible on the table for Iran in exchange for these actions. That could be unfreezing more frozen Iranian assets and transferring them to Qatar for humanitarian purposes. That could be perhaps working with China or others on some limited oil sales. But again, something that demonstrates to Iran that there still are tangible, realizable benefits for engaging diplomatically, with the United States. And ideally, this type of de-escalatory package could stabilize the current crisis and buy time and space for the more comprehensive negotiation that we're going to need to begin immediately after the US presidential election. And I'm happy to talk more about this, in the question and answer, but I think the US is going to have to approach these negotiations with a new framework in mind. I think the JCPOA demonstrated that there are challenges to this very transactional approach to nonproliferation agreements. Not only does the US face a credibility deficit, but the US also, I think, encountered, and we now better understand that there are significant challenges to actually realizing sanctions relief. The lifting part is easy. Ensuring that a country benefits once the sanctions are lifted is much more challenging. So I think we have to diversify the array of incentives that we put on the table for Iran. And maybe we shouldn't even just be looking at Iran. Maybe this is multiple agreements that includes countries in the region that tries to capture some of the proliferation challenges that we're facing in other spaces, like Saudi Arabia. So with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker and very much look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Kelsey. Sharon.
Thank you. Actually, I didn't prepare opening remarks, so you'll have to
Okay.
bear with me. I see, let's start with what we know, which is not a whole terrible amount. We have been negotiating with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for 15 years on a nuclear cooperation agreement. This is kind of a long time. In other cases, perhaps with Japan or South Korea at various times, it's taken a few years, but not 15 years. And why is that? First, in the early years, Saudi Arabia was very hesitant to do certain things that we wanted them to do in a nuclear cooperation agreement. The additional protocol. They had a small quantities protocol. Sorry for getting into all this technical stuff. But this latest iteration, or this latest round of negotiations with Saudi Arabia, has gotten tangled up in this strategic deal. I see this as another chapter in some not very successful attempts by the US to dangle nuclear energy for strategic purposes. I would call this a special deal for a special ally. Only in the case of Saudi Arabia, what a special ally. We know that our special nuclear deal with India, at least so far, and it's been at least 15 years, has perhaps not yielded what we wanted from that. We still don't have nuclear contracts with India, but maybe they're a little more amenable to pressure when it comes to China. But in the case of Saudi Arabia, there is an odd precedent, and I wrote about this in the December 2023 edition of Arms Control Today. And I was surprised, actually, when I started researching it. And the precedent was Egypt and the Camp David Accords. I almost get the sense that the US government sort of crafted this policy with very little input from the non-proliferation community, right? So the Camp David Accords paved the way for a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, which has been quite successful, right, for the most part. And as a result of that, we signed what we call a 123 agreement, Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act, with Egypt. Egypt at that time, Egypt did not have any nuclear assets, or very few. Egypt at that time wanted to reprocess spent fuel. And as you all know, we've had a long-standing, decades-long standing policy against the spread of both reprocessing technology and enrichment technology, two technologies that have dual uses, very sensitive. Egypt was also interested in nuclear cooperation with Russia at the time. What we did in that nuclear cooperation agreement was to get the Egyptians to say, no, we won't reprocess, all right, on our soil. This is actually the origin of what has become to be known as the gold standard, right? What you don't often hear and you don't often see in the press is that the gold standard began as a regional policy from the US, right? We didn't want, in particular, to spread enrichment and reprocessing technologies in the Middle East. So our 2009 agreement with the UAE, which is often, held up as, the gold standard, that wasn't the beginning. And why is this important? Because those agreements, so now our agreement with Egypt has lapsed. I wonder why. They're now in the arms of Russian nuclear technology. Those agreements in the Middle East all have a clause, and it says, it's basically a no undercut clause. And it says, if another party in the region, if we conduct an agreement or you conduct an agreement with another party in the region that provides other capabilities, you kind of have the right to renegotiate. It's not exactly written that way, but that's the general gist. This is a problem. We don't have a lot of agreements with countries in the Middle East, but we do. So we have one with the UAE, and we have one with Turkey. So if the press reports are correct, that one of the benefits that we are dangling in front of the Saudis is a uranium enrichment capability, and we don't know the contours of that, right? Is it a US built and operated facility? Is there some kind of black box technology that keeps the Saudis from getting access to sensitive information? But wait a minute, I lost my train of thought.
I think what you were saying is that we're now at a point where, at least if reports are correct, the United States is dangling the possibility of a uranium enrichment facility for Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. If that is the case, this will overturn not just one, but two policies, right? One is we don't want enrichment and reprocessing, we'll leave reprocessing aside, enrichment technology to spread to additional countries. And goodness knows we've spent a lot of effort in the policy community over the years trying to enforce that. And the second one is this regional policy to maintain equal terms and conditions for nuclear cooperation in the Middle East. So that's a first problem with this approach. The second problem is that it raises risks from other countries, right? What would Iran's reaction be? And I endorse your notion of perhaps coming up with a regional solution. What about South Korea? We're almost in a double bind with South Korea because of the AUKUS deal. And if we, and they have been pressuring us, and so far we have, I would say, staved off the requests both in the nuclear cooperation agreement negotiations, but also in other bilateral arrangements. But the pressure could certainly grow from South Korea, and that raises, to get either a similar deal as Saudi Arabia, or maybe they decide to go it alone. Are there constraints against this? Yes. How good are those constraints, right? So the Nuclear Suppliers Group says if a country wants to, if an agreement includes the spread of enrichment or reprocessing technology to a new country, that country has to have an additional protocol. Yeah, South Korea has an additional protocol. My guess is that Saudi Arabia will also have an additional protocol as part of this arrangement. Is that good? Absolutely. Is it enough? No. I guess I almost want to take a poll of those of you in the audience. Did you feel better with the JCPOA in effect with Iran's enrichment?
Let's do that, actually.
Yeah.
If you're willing to, raise
your hand. Did you feel better when the JCPOA was in effect? Yes, And why is that? It's because the Non-Proliferation Treaty does not prohibit enrichment or reprocessing. It's not in the treaty itself, right? But it is enforced through all of these, bilateral nuclear cooperation agreements, enforced, through working with our allies, in the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And we also try to get our allies, South Korea is a good one, because they've been very good on this, in terms of putting such restrictions in their nuclear cooperation agreements. You could even get more creative and say, well, what other countries might be interested? Poland? Australia? In any event, I think I'll stop there. I have a host of things I would like to recommend, both in the cooperation agreement. I see a lot of problems. Many of you may know I worked for the Congressional Research Service for a while and analyzed this for a living. But there are definite weaknesses in the Atomic Energy Act that I think we could plug. The question is, how urgent do members of Congress or the administration see this? I will say one last thing. For 15 years, we've been negotiating with the Saudis on this, and for 11 years, they have insisted that they would get the same capabilities that Iran has. And so you really need to ask the question, and this is why I feel like the non-proliferation community has not been really polled on all of this. Should you really be sharing enrichment technology in any shape or form with a country that has openly said it would acquire nuclear weapons capabilities in a specific scenario, which doesn't look that far off, actually, in the Middle East? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sharon. And let me also thank Negar, who stepped into the breach at the last moment because one of our panelists was ill. And I'd like to start by asking you two questions, if I may. One, why didn't Israel's attack on the Iranian embassy complex in Damascus and then the subsequent direct Iranian retaliation, why didn't that erupt into a wider conflagration? Question one. Question two, do you think that exchange has changed the balance of power or changed Iranian strategic thinking and made it any more or less likely that they might someday choose to pursue nuclear weapons?
Thank you. Thanks, Arshad, Kelsey, Sharon. Great to be here, filling in for my colleagues, to see who is sick. I think, well, first talking about Iran and Israel, and then we can tie it back to this discussion. I think that episode, although it seemed like it could become a dangerous escalation, for those of you, I'm sure everyone knows the details, but Israeli attack on the consulate in Damascus, a number of Iranians killed, then Iran for the first time attacking Israeli soil from its soil. And then Israel also retaliating in the same fashion, attacking Iran from its soil. I think the way, and I'll try to explain the view from Tehran a little more, was that the Israeli attack came on the heels of years of a shadow war, and this is way before October 7th, between Iran and Israel. So they have been engaged in sort of this shadow war, mainly in Syria, across the region. And there have been back and forth, but not to that level. I think what happened as far as that attack on the consulate from Tehran's viewpoint was seen as an escalation, a brazen attack on a diplomatic facility, and sort of very publicly. And so they saw that as on a different level and something worth responding to. The way that they sort of portray it as establishing deterrence, not necessarily escalating into something bigger. And so what I think the response entailed from Tehran's side was to show, that they have the capacity to attack Israeli soil from the soil, and also the will. That's also very important. That the assumption was that they wouldn't. Maybe they can, but they wouldn't. And that they're not interested in an open war with Israel, which I think is true. Actually, I would argue that none of the two sides really are interested in bringing that shadow war into the open, direct confrontation. And also the third and maybe very important party here, the United States, is not interested in either direct confrontation with Iran or Iran and Israel in direct confrontation. So looking at that triangle, I think the Iranians saw that escalation. They tried to respond, but in a calculated way. They had been telegraphing that they're going to respond in a way using back channels to sort of letting the Americans know too. All of that aimed at minimizing the impact or the casualties, but nevertheless doing the attack to show the capacity and their will. And then the Israeli response also on Iranian soil, I think, was also measured and calculated, aimed at showing that they're also willing to respond, but not really taking this to the next level into an escalation. So I think, and then also the role of the US with the Biden administration, basically, to simplify, making it clear that they would be there in the defense. So when Iran attacks, the US helped Israel, but they wouldn't engage in an offense, essentially attacking Iran, which is something that many analysts and watchers had been fearing of, essentially the Netanyahu government pulling the United States into an open war with Iran. I think the Biden administration sort of drew that line very clear, and that triangle essentially turned into this not really escalating into next level, but both sides sort of establishing deterrence, and also new red lines, because I think the red lines have been moving and blurring in the past 7-8 months since October 7th across the region with the dynamics shifting. And so this sort of brought Iran and Israel kind of to a new level, but also back to, I would say, where they saw they were as far as a shadow war. And then to your next question on weaponization, I don't think this episode at least has changed the thinking or the policy in Tehran. We just saw that letter from the Iranian mission in response to the EU letter yesterday, again emphasizing diplomacy, the fact that their nuclear program is peaceful, not interested in weaponizing. I think Tehran enjoys being in sort of this threshold state, as Kelsey explained in much better details, but not breaking into an actual weapons program. So having the option, sort of using that as a leverage, their only leverage really when they're looking to the other side and the economic incentives, the sanctions relief. But I don't think the calculation is to weaponize. The policy hasn't really been that for about 2 decades, and we know also the Supreme Leader has a fatwa to sort of send that public message. So until he's alive, he's Supreme Leader, and nothing really major has changed or shifted. Even that episode with Israel, some thought maybe that would be the final straw, but that didn't change. So unless something major happens, I don't know, like a US attack on Iran's nuclear program, ironically, may actually change that kind of decision making. But I don't foresee anything major that would make them change that policy and shift towards a weapons program. But I think they enjoy sort of pushing the line at this threshold state and even going further for leverage.
Super. Thank you so much. Kelsey, I'm going to lob a couple of questions at you. One, I think it's important, probably not so much for the people in the room, but perhaps for others watching, to understand the distinction between the ability to produce fissile material for nuclear weapon and weaponization. As Negar was just saying, that is to say the actual ability to build a nuclear device that can explode when and where you want it to. So just one quick question. If Iran is now, as you said, a week from the ability to produce enough enriched uranium for one bomb, where is it in terms of its, or what is publicly known about its weaponization efforts? To your knowledge, is there anything to have changed? The NIE, I think from 2006, which said that the US intelligence community believed that Iran had ceased weaponization efforts in 2003. So where are we on weaponization? How long might it take for Iran to actually build a weapon if they wish to?
Well, it's a fairly quick question. I'm not sure I have a quick answer, unfortunately, because it is quite complicated. I mean, as I said, the time frame to produce fissile material is relatively short. Weaponization is much more difficult to gauge those time frames in an open source space. I think many experts, including myself, assess that based on the work Iran had done prior to 2003, when they had an organized program, that if Tehran really wanted to, they could probably build a nuclear weapon in as little as 6 months. The Congressional Research Service has quoted a US official as saying a year, others say 1 to 2 years. But to a certain extent, that time frame is less important when we're talking about risk, because once Iran has produced its fissile material, it's likely to divert that weapons-grade material to covert locations, possibly multiple covert locations, for the weaponization process. So if the United States or Israel is looking to try to disrupt a dash to a bomb, the best chance that they have is in the fissile material production phase, because they know where it is, and ideally, because of the existing monitoring, they would have some time to try to react if it was clear that Iran was then enriching to 90%. But that's another reason why I think that these short time frames, the lack of monitoring, is so concerning. I mean, like Negar said, I agree, with Negar's assessment that the supreme leader, I think, does feel bound by his fatwa, and there hasn't been a decision in Iran to develop nuclear weapons. I mean, current U.S. intelligence community assessments support that, saying there hasn't been a resumption of key weaponization activities. But the chance of miscalculating Iran's intentions right now is, I think, higher than it ever has been in the history of the Iranian nuclear issue. We now have senior officials in Iran and former officials saying that Iran's calculus might change. It might rethink the fatwa if security conditions change. You combine that with a weak breakout and a misperception, misinterpretation of an Iranian development, an accidental spike of enrichment. All of these, I think, could put us on the path to conflict, because we don't have the time to analyze the response, because I do think the United States and Israel are very serious when they say they will resort to force rather than allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. So even though the weaponization timeframe makes it sound like we have more time, my fear is that these windows have become so small, the risk of miscalculation and the ability.
We are going to a non-declared nuclear site, and we want to see what's going on there. Secondly, and I'm going to get a little wonky, but I know those of you in the room will be pleased and not dismayed by this. If I understand it right, under so-called modified code 3.1, Iran is obliged under its safeguards agreement to tell the IAEA if it is building a nuclear facility. And if I understand the Iranians correctly, they've said, we're not doing that anymore. And the IAEA said, well, yeah, you have to. Given the absence of SNAP inspections and given this, does the IAEA actually have the ability to figure out what it doesn't know? Or are we now in a world where Iran is perfectly capable of building secret sites and potentially diverting some indeterminate number of centrifuge parts, which I don't think the IAEA now knows how many there are, therefore how many centrifuges Iran may have, to secret sites?
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
Sure, no, I'll take a stab at it. Look, the biggest hurdle in the nuclear weapons enterprise is the fissile material production. So that should give you a sense. Iran is enriching up to 60% and could go higher. So all this talk about, how long does it take? The 6-month time frame, that's used in the U.S. government, or at least it was when I was there. That's, that's kind of an assumption. It's like once you get the fissile material, anybody should pretty much be able to do it. So my guess is that it's much shorter for Iran. I think you can read between the lines of IAEA reports and understand that they're challenged. And you have to ask the question, these what we call snap inspections, right? Or the ability to go anywhere, anytime, which is never really anywhere, anytime. And there is a host of ways in which a country can delay things, obfuscate. Oh, the weather's bad today. The road's closed. So many different ways that they can do that. I don't see the modified, Iran's statement that it would not adhere to the early declaration of new facilities. To me, that's a little bit of a red herring. If they're going to have a secret facility, it's not like they're going to build it and then eventually tell the IAEA, right? They're just going to do it. And the problem with uranium enrichment, and specifically with centrifuge facilities, is that there are very few signatures that you can detect remotely. So it is always a good thing to have people on the ground, on-site inspections. It is always a good thing to be able to interview people. We found that out in Iraq in the 1990s. You learn a lot of things by walking around and seeing how people react. So I agree. Like the less access, the restrictions on access, that degrades the IAEA's capability. But I think also in the popular press and among popularly, people think of the International Atomic Energy Agency as this watchdog, right? That they're going to go out there and find things. The truth of the matter is much more that countries who are concerned help the IAEA. And a lot of that depends on levels of cooperation. Levels of cooperation even within the secretariat of the IAEA, and all of that is at a much lower, all of that cooperation has dropped down significantly for a variety of reasons. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Kelsey, Sharon did so well on that. I'm gonna pass over you on this one, but I have a question for you and then one for Negar. You talked about your view that the administration should seek a sort of de-escalatory set of steps. You talked about it dangling some carrots, like the unfreezing of assets. Two questions. One, do you think there is a plausible diplomatic path to a meaningful agreement that would roll back Iran's nuclear program? And second, for Negar, why would Iran ever trust the United States to adhere to a nuclear deal, given the experience that they just had of negotiating one with the Obama administration and seeing it tossed aside a couple of years later by the Trump administration? Please.
Thanks. So I certainly think there's a plausible path to immediate de-escalation in the short term. I think just last year, Iran was willing to engage in moderating some of its more proliferation-sensitive activities in exchange for the unfreezing of U.S. assets. Now, the U.S. refroze those assets after October 7th. Iran no longer felt bound then by the voluntary actions it agreed to take. But I think that some of Tehran's statements since then suggest that Iran may be willing to a similar type arrangement. And in conversations between the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran and the IAEA, those officials in Iran have said that they are looking for sanctions relief in exchange for additional transparency and monitoring. The IAEA cannot put that on the table. The United States can. So I think it's critical that the United States tries to follow up, on these offers, or on this perhaps an opening that Iran might be signaling once the new Iranian president, is elected. I don't think we're going to see anything now until after that election in terms of diplomacy and space. On your second, more broadly, would Iran be interested in a broader deal that rolls back its program? I think that is a much more challenging question right now. because Iran is trying to leverage this threshold status for its security and national interests. Will it be willing to give that up? I don't know, but I think we have to test that prospect, because what the United States can put on the table in terms of economic benefits, I still think would be attractive to Iran, particularly if we can think about how to realize the sanctions lifting, given some of Iran's other sort of stated goals. Now, because of the advances I mentioned, I think rollback is challenging. I think this is going to have to be a much more focused monitoring arrangement, perhaps some unique elements that provide greater visibility and perhaps monitoring on some of the weaponization aspects of the program, not just the fissile material. But certainly, I think there are enough indications coming from Tehran that they are interested in an agreement, that we have to pursue something in the short term, but also think about that new framework for the long term. Because that really is, we really need to do this, because this idea of Iran staying on the threshold is just not sustainable. There's too much risk that the security environment could push Iran to rethink its consideration and develop nuclear weapons. There's too much risk of miscalculation. So really we need that longer term framework, and it's worth investing time now into thinking what it looks like.
Negar, why would the Iranians trust the United States, given that memories of 1953 are also quite fresh in the Iranian minds? Why would they engage in such an agreement?
Well, they don't. I mean, even the JCPOA, I think, the withdrawal, the Trump administration withdrawal from JCPOA surprised many of us, I think, in the US, but also in Iran, and it sort of sidelined that idea or that camp in Iran, the more moderate pro-Western or pro-diplomacy camp, that there is a way that we can deliver, that we can negotiate, and we can get a deal. I don't think anything like that would be possible, but I agree with Kelsey. I still think there's space for diplomacy. There is interest for diplomacy in Iran, but it wouldn't look like something like JCPOA, something that, you know, encompassing and future-looking. The JCPOA had a lot of promises as far as investment into the future, you know, sanctions relief that would then bring economic benefits. I think what the Iranians are more interested in or looking for is sort of step-by-step, like Chelsea was suggesting, unfreezing of assets here, something tangible that you can see, that you don't have to rely on for 1 or 2 or 3 US administrations after. I think the Biden administration, I've said this and let me repeat it again, missed a very golden window of opportunity at the beginning of the administration, about 6 months, when they overlap with still the Rouhani administration in Tehran. That was really the time for the US, before Ukraine, before October 7th, before the world got so crazy, to sort of either return to the JCPOA or reach out with serious, meaningful diplomacy. And unfortunately, that didn't happen until about April, so month 4, and then it hit the presidential election in Iran. But now, with the death of Iranian president and ultra-conservative, hardline Ebrahim Raisi, there may be a new opening. We still have to wait and see. Iranian elections are coming up soon. But there are indications that there may be sort of a slight shift to the center, not towards moderates or reformists by any means, but a less hardline president, and then a follow-up to that, a less hardline foreign minister could indicate even more interest in diplomacy, either in a second Biden term or potentially whoever becomes US president. So we have these 2 important elections coming up sort of in Iran and then also in the US that can show us the path forward. But going back to what Kelsey was saying, I really agree. I think there is still interest. Even in the letter yesterday in Iran, we see the emphasis that they're interested in a diplomatic solution, even in the JCPOA, they say, but in I would say, in more different and creative formats.
Thank you. Kelsey, question for you. If President Trump is reelected, do you expect him to pursue a so-called maximum pressure policy toward Iran? And is maximum pressure, in an economic sense, even conceivable in a world in which China seems quite happy to buy Iranian oil, albeit not with its official kind of, state refiners. I mean, one of the neat, unusual things about the JCPOA was you had this consensus among the P5+1, and the Chinese actually did significantly reduce their purchases. So do you see maximum pressure, and is that even possible today?
Well, I think I learned my lesson during the first Trump administration of the challenges of trying to predict what might happen. So, I mean, you can take this with a grain of salt. I do think that, yes, we would see a second Trump administration lean very hard into the maximum pressure focus with an attempt to try to get Iran back to the negotiating table to get a deal that Trump could then say was better than the JCPOA. But as you said, maximum pressure today cannot be what maximum pressure was during the first Trump administration, and it cannot be what the pressure campaign was in the lead up to the JCPOA, in large part because of the geopolitical situation that we're in. I mean, one thing that I think is most striking looking at the non-proliferation regime writ large over the past several years is that we have lost some of the core unity between the P5 on certain non-proliferation norms. I mean, it was not that long ago that we had cooperation at the Security Council on North Korea. It was not that long ago that Russia and China implemented sanctions on Iran under the Security Council umbrella and engaged very helpfully within the JCPOA context. So without that basis, I think it's going to be much more challenging to sustain pressure on Iran. And I think that already fragile coalition that the U.S. may try to rebuild from a pressure perspective could be disrupted even further if the European Union or the E3, or really just the France or the United Kingdom, go ahead with trying to reimpose UN sanctions that were lifted under the JCPOA. There's a measure in the Security Council resolution that endorsed the JCPOA that would allow them to do that in a way that cannot be vetoed by Russia and China. Enacting this measure before it expires in October 2025 is likely just to deepen that rift between the West and Russia, and perhaps more importantly right now, between the West and China, because China, I think, has more influence on Iran, and I think China does not want to see Iran develop nuclear weapons, but they are not going to want to respect a snapback of those UN measures. So I think the international disunity on nonproliferation really makes addressing the Iran crisis more challenging. And I think we have to look for more novel ways to try to reinforce nonproliferation norms, at least between the US, Europe, and China, in a way that can help support addressing the Iranian crisis, even if we don't directly reference Iran. I think we are much more likely to garner Beijing support if we talk about nonproliferation norms more broadly, and then it's the US who perhaps directs them as being applicable sort of in the Iranian case. So I think maximum pressure will be on the table, but I'm not sure how maximum it will be.
Negar, how do you think Iran may respond to a Trump maximum pressure campaign such as it would be? Do you think one would see additional attacks by Iranian proxies, say, like the attacks on the Abqaiq oil facilities in Saudi Arabia? Do you think you're going to see Iranian kind of nuclear acceleration? How do you think they'd respond, or regional escalation? How do you think they would respond to it?
I think more of what we saw under the Trump administration, let's not forget, Donald Trump is the person who pulled the U.S. out of the JCPOA and also assassinated the Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani. So even though in a strange way he seems more interested in having a deal with the Iranian, and that sort of looks like an opening, it also creates a challenge for Iran, and also that the larger ally network they have, the so-called axis of resistance, to sit and negotiate and actually make a deal with this person, which is Donald Trump. So the personnel in the form of a President Trump makes it very difficult. I don't know, it depends on also who he brings with himself if he becomes president to the White House. Is it going to be the Mike Pompeo's and the John Bolton's, sort of the Iran hawks, or is it going to be, a new slate of personnel? So all of that, I think, matters. But assuming there will be more of the same, sort of maximum pressure 2.0, I agree with Kelsey. I don't think it achieved what it was supposed to achieve, either in the form of a better deal, which it couldn't get, or essentially making Iran capitulate to the 10-point requests of Secretary Pompeo. So I think it will be more of the same. So Iran sort of pushing the envelope as much as they can, creating headache here and there, depending on how the regional dynamic also unfolds. The war in Gaza, that's sort of the very top immediate issue, how that will, by the time of the U.S. election, will there be a ceasefire? Will the fighting continue across the region? Will it escalate into new fronts in Lebanon and with other members of the resistance? Or if sort of that slows down, I think all of these are moving parts we have to look at. And also who becomes president in Iran. Is it someone more to the center of the hardliners, someone like Larijani, if he's allowed to run and win? Or is it someone like Saeed Jalili? These are the big names, or Ghalibaf. All of these will also sort of make shifts that would show again the path forward. So a lot of ifs.
Sure. No. I'd like to pick on something you said, Kelsey, and Pranay Vadi spoke about the October 2025 moment at which the ability for Britain and France to trigger snapback of UN sanctions will expire. You made clear, I think, that you don't think that's such a great idea. Do you think it might prompt Iran to withdraw from the NPT?
Yes.
Ouch.
No, I mean, I think Iran has been consistent in messaging that snapback would prompt it to take that step. Now, what I think we could see from Iran is notifying of its intention to withdraw from the NPT, but then using the window between notification and withdrawal taking into effect to try to really leverage something from the United States and Europe to get it to not follow through on withdrawal. So that's, I think, maybe a long way of saying that even if Iran takes that step, we should not assume that Iran is necessarily going to develop nuclear weapons. Certainly, it would be concerning if Iran did that, particularly if they then kick out all IAEA inspectors and don't negotiate any new type of safeguards arrangement. But I think that is a very real risk looking to October 2025, that the Europeans will do this if there is no progress on the diplomatic front, which to me, again, just underscores that we have to be pursuing diplomacy with Iran with much more urgency, with much more creativity, with much more flexibility, and looking to partners like China that might have more influence to try to use those relationships to address this issue before we get to October 2025, because we should not test Iran on whether or not it will withdraw from the NPT in that scenario.
So let's pivot to Saudi Arabia for a moment. Sharon, what do you think we are likely to see in a U.S.-Saudi nuclear cooperation deal? Is there any possibility of there being a separate 1, 2, 3 agreement that is not embedded in the broader other things that I described at the beginning and all part of a package for Israeli-Saudi normalization? And a last question. Don't the strategic folks always win out over the non-proliferation folks? I say that as a native Washingtonian. It seems like the people who pursue strategic goals are usually able to beat the people who pursue non-proliferation goals, however strategic those might be.
Let me answer that second question first. Yes, which is why we need a deep dive on exactly how their strategic goals are faring, because I think historically you'll see that it doesn't quite always work out the way they want it to. I thought you were going to ask me the question, if Iran pulls out of the NPT, will Saudi Arabia pull out of the NPT?
Please.
Yes. No. I don't know. But I like the fact that Kelsey brought up, or kind of implicitly suggested, we shouldn't panic immediately if Iran leaves the NPT, because it would provide them with a lot of leverage. Arshad, I think your idea is great. Yeah, the 123 agreement should not be embedded in any kind of bigger deal. But the real problem is that the congressional review of nuclear cooperation agreements, that process is broken. It's broken for a lot of reasons, but let me tell you how it works now. The administration signs an agreement and presents it in front of Congress, and they'll go through, does it check the 9 requirements of, Section 123? Invariably, it says yes, and then, it goes through unless Congress can enact a law against it, right? That's a huge, huge hurdle.
Right.
How it was supposed to work was that the administration was supposed to consult with, Senate Foreign Relations and House Committee on Foreign Affairs, all along in the process. And I will say that, there was a hearing on the Hill several weeks ago, and there were very few questions answered by the administration on this deal. And so really if somebody made me emperor tomorrow, I would amend that Atomic Energy Act to provide more oversight, or somehow to tweak it so that there really is a better review process. There's another trend which has flown under the radar forever, and that is that these agreements have, they have a certain duration, right? But then there's a little clause that says, oh yeah, rolling extension every 5 years. Or in the case of Taiwan and Japan, indefinite extension. So we are nuclear cooperation partners with Japan and Taiwan forever, no matter what happens. Okay, so the agreement itself says, yes, if they test a nuclear device, the cooperation agreement is dead. But surely there must be other things short of testing a nuclear device that might cause us to reconsider. So, I've testified before Congress a couple times on this and made a whole bunch of recommendations. But really, I think, Congress needs to think hard about the approval process. In general, what they've done, and that means amending the Atomic Energy Act, what they have done is done country-specific legislation. So they did it on India. There's a bill on the Hill right now on the Saudi agreement. But again, it's hard to pass a bill. I think I heard recently only 3% of bills ever get enacted into law. Above all, though, also the non-proliferation assessment statement, which the State Department is required to do. It's done in an unclassified and a classified way. I think that Congress needs to set specific requirements for those, because the ones that I've read at the unclassified level barely scratch the surface. I mean, I understand that there is a perspective in the U.S. government now that, we have to do nuclear trade with a lot of countries, because if we don't do it, the Russians and the Chinese will. And our cooperation is better than theirs because we uphold non-proliferation standards. If that is the case, then we have to be very serious about those non-proliferation standards. And I get the sense that in this rush to compete with Russia and China, that it's actually a rush to, I forget what the phrase is, to...
Rush to the bottom?
Rush to the bottom, exactly.
Negar,
And if nuclear energy is going to, there are some folks out there, I am not among them, but if you really think that nuclear energy is going to make a difference for climate change and that we need to build thousands of reactors, this is a very serious issue that needs to get as much attention and money as the promotion of nuclear reactor exports does.
Negar, I'd like to ask you a question that we got online from Chase Winner with Energy Intelligence. What leverage does the United States have with Iran, given the Gaza war, regional escalation, the upcoming change of supreme leader that could change Iran's political calculus. So what leverage does the U.S. have vis-a-vis Iran?
Well, I think a lot. It's mostly economic leverage. So Iran has been sanctioned and over-sanctioned by consecutive administrations. So the U.S. has a lot of leverage in the form of sanctions relief. Now it can be short-term, it can be long-term. As Kelsey suggested, it could be in the form of oil sales. It lacks even enforcement of sanctions, unfreezing of assets, something Iranians have mentioned or alluded to. So I think what Iran is looking to the other side, and this is not just the US but also Europe, is mostly in a form of that economic benefits or the leverage. The JCPOA promised long-term, more cooperation with the West, especially with Europe, which is something that sort of moderate camp in Iran promised in the form of investments, opening of trade, and bilateral relations with the Europeans. I think the hopes for that are not so high in Iran anymore, especially after the Trump pullout and everything. But still, the U.S. has, I think, immense leverage in the form of economic incentives that the Iranians have been either publicly or privately alluded to.
Kelsey, we have another online question, which is, do you think the Iranians will choose ultimately to follow the bomb on the shelf approach, by which I assume means threshold capability, or the bomb in the basement approach?
I'm going to hope I understand bomb in the basement perhaps to be...
I'm guessing it means secretly building a bomb
yeah.
and actually having one, although it's not clear to me what the utility of having a secret bomb is, but anyway.
Well, I think that there is some evidence to suggest that looking in some of the documents that Israel stole from Iran in 2018, the Atomic Archive as it's referred to, that Iran's plan for developing nuclear weapons prior to 2003 may have been to build a small number of nuclear devices, but not really draw attention to them or sort of publicly say that Iran had a deterrent unless it was necessary for a security perspective. So that might be kind of part of the question about, would Iran go down that route again? But I think in general, it would be very challenging for Iran to develop an entire parallel covert program to build nuclear weapons from start to finish without detection somewhere in the process. And I'm not thinking as much here of the IAEA's on the ground inspections. That certainly is important. But when you think of the surveillance and intelligence gathering that the United States, that Israel, that others do on Iran, we were able to detect their secret facilities in the past, and I think we would likely be able to do so again if they tried to go that complete kind of covert pathway. I mean, my biggest concern is that we'd see a combination of the overt and the covert if there was a decision to develop nuclear weapons. And what I mean by that is, Iran has this stockpile of near weapons-grade material, sitting at its declared facilities. If it moves that material and then tried to enrich it at an illicit site, would we be able to follow that? Would we be able to take action against the facility if we were able to identify it? So I may be more concerned about the bomb that's between the basement and the shelf and that kind of combination of pathways if I was kind of ranking where the risk is. But I think for now, absent a significant degradation in the security situation, whether that be an attack, a direct attack by Israel or the United States on Iran, or a significant degradation of Iran's proxies and partners like Hezbollah, Iran is going to be pretty content to kind of stay in that threshold status unless it is induced by the United States to move back. Mm-hmm. So again, I probably sound like a broken record here, but again, the urgency of diplomacy now, I just think is so critical so we don't have to defend against one on the shelf or the basement.
Can I ask you a follow-up on that? So in a way, you were talking about your fear of a bomb on a U-Haul truck. So a bomb that they build and then move somewhere and you don't know where it is. Do you think the United States, Israel, the other intelligence agencies that track this, if you were to bet, would you bet they'd be able to detect that?
If it was just one, yeah, I would think maybe, yes, they would be able to detect that. But that's why, as I said, nobody is worried about Iran breaking out to build one bomb.
Sure.
One bomb doesn't provide them a deterrent. If they can break out to build 5 or 6, can we monitor, 5 or 6 U-Hauls? I personally don't want to be in a position where we find out whether or not the United States and Israel can actually do that. So again, diplomacy now, so we don't have to test that capability.
I'd like to ask all of you sort of a final question, which is to look at kind of the nightmare scenario that is several steps ahead of this. And that would be Iran does choose to build nuclear weapons. It builds multiple nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia carries through on its stated intent to acquire nuclear weapons. If Iran does, you then see further proliferation, say, in Turkey or elsewhere. Let's assume then that the U.S. government is that we are all living in that world of multiple nuclear-armed states in the Middle East. How do you deal with that? Is there any plausible way to deter those states from attacking each other, attacking the United States? How do you grapple with that ugly scenario?
Okay, I can go first. I mean, I don't want to envision that in part because it makes me feel like I will have failed in my job in non-proliferation policy if we get there, but that aside, I mean, again, I think there is a difference between a willingness to possess nuclear weapons and an intention to use them. And if we have, multiple, nuclear-armed states, I think they are going to be kind of focused on deterring each other. I imagine in that scenario, the United States will still have, significantly larger nuclear arsenal that could be utilized by partners and allies in the region that might be trying to respond to any sort of attempts at nuclear coercion, by Iran. But if we do end up in that scenario, it might also open the door for more creative regional solutions. And I think one thing that we have to keep in mind when we think about nuclear diplomacy with Iran is that it is not going to be a panacea for all of the problems that the United States has with Iran and all of the security dynamics within the region. And so we have to, as we think about nuclear diplomacy, be supporting the regional states in looking at their own types of looking at their own security arrangements so that no state in the region ever gets to the point where it is going to think it needs nuclear weapons. So I know, diplomacy again, but again, so thinking about nuclear diplomacy accompanied by support for regional security diplomacy to prevent that reality, I think is crucial.
Sharon, Negar, would either of you like to contemplate that scenario?
I commend Kelsey for her diplomatic response. I'll be less diplomatic. If you loved the Cold War, you're really going to love that proliferated world. It is a nightmare scenario for so many different reasons, and you have to ask the question, at what point does the U.S. simply throw up its hands, because with so many nuclear weapon states there, it gets very complicated. We were very almost coddled by
simplicity,
by the or very lucky in our ability to deter nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and Russia now so far. So that is a world I don't want to contemplate or live in. So let's avoid it.
Listen, Negar, did you?
The
You're
same
good?
thing. I mean, it really is a nightmare scenario. I don't want to envision it. I don't think we're there yet, and I don't think it would happen overnight. Like, a lot of things have to go wrong for the region to get there. But I just agree with Sharon and Kelsey. And as you said, it's a nightmare. And so let's hope we don't get there, and let's use diplomacy, which I agree with Kelsey. I'm glad you keep repeating it, is the only path forward and really the only meaningful way, especially in the case of Iran, where I focus on. It's been the only successful solution that was tried and succeeded temporarily once. Any other path has just not really brought any results. So let's try to focus and use diplomacy in whatever space that's left.
Well, listen, thank you all very much for the panel, and that ends this session, and I think we're going to have a brief coffee break. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Arshad, and I want to thank everybody in this panel, Arshad for your great moderation, Sharon, and Negar for stepping in at the 11th hour, and I also want to express a public thank you to Kelsey Davenport, who I've had the pleasure to work with for over a decade, who's been leading ACA's efforts on the Iran nuclear file, and I wish things were in better shape, Kelsey, but we're going to keep pressing forward on the challenges ahead. As Arshad said, we're going to take a brief 5-minute break while we do a microphone switchover. Do not go far, please, because we've got a great panel coming up on issues related to U.S. arms transfer policy. Thanks all.